Hello, everyone. I think I've got the volume turned up on my headphones today because the intro music was particularly intense. I was thinking this is like really extreme. But today I'm going to be talking to Dan Speak about the problem of evil. So Dan's a Christian philosopher. Do you want to kind of just fill people in a little bit about your background for those who kind of aren't familiar with you, so they've got some idea?
Sure. I don't know what's interesting about the background, but so I teach philosophy at Loyola Marymount University. Here now, looking out my window, in case anybody's in bad weather, I'm looking out over Marina Del Rey out my window. So just rubbing it in for anybody who's in.
Yeah, I was gonna. We've got
Yeah.
a nice
What's yours?
gray
Oh yeah.
Scottish, kind
Sure.
of
Sure.
cloudy. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm in
Yeah. Well,
Glasgow.
I mean, you've got gray and cloudy, but you have culture. By the on my
Exactly.
end, it's lovely out, but no culture. So
Right.
Um, so I teach at Loyola Marymount University. I've been teaching here about 15 years. I did my PhD at the University of California, Riverside, and have been working on issues about the metaphysics of free will, but especially of those interact with problems in philosophy of religion. And that led naturally to me thinking about the problem of evil for reasons that I'm guessing we'll probably end up talking a bit about, but your astute viewers will already see the connections there probably. And so I ended up writing this book in 2014, and no one has cared about it but you. So it's
Well, I
perfect.
came across the book actually from a conversation you had with a channel called The Analytic Christian. So I actually
Yeah,
really like that channel. I mean, I'm critical of a lot of apologetic efforts online, but I like his project and what he's got going on over there. So,
yeah,
and I like those conversations. So.
yeah. I enjoyed Jordan. I thought he seemed very astute and cautious and careful and willing to consider objections well. So it was nice. Yeah.
So I'm going to focus on the contents from the book in today's conversation, so people can check that out if they want to kind of hear more about what you've got to say about this topic.
Sure.
And I've got a few questions to kind of start us off that are a little bit outside of the book. The first one is to do with arguments from evil, and so I wondered if you would distinguish between sort of like atheological arguments from evil and like the problem of evil. I've seen some people think there's maybe a significant difference here. Some people think they're the same thing. Are you broadly just okay with saying they're the same thing, or do you want to kind of parse out a difference?
Yeah, good. What I try to say in the book is there's probably a bunch of things that run under the banner the problem of evil, and maybe there are many problems, but at least for the purpose of the book, I take the idea that what I'm trying to address are those versions of the problem that amount to arguments from evil for atheism. So I take it as a sort of polemic problem where someone's arguing that God doesn't exist on the basis of the existence of evil in some form or other, and that anything that does that counts as some version of the problem of evil. I do think, as you're noting, Nathan, I do think that there are problems of evil that aren't strictly speaking like that. That is, I think, for example, that the theist has a problem of evil, even if she's totally convinced that God exists and she doesn't think that evil counts as evidence against it. I mean, it might be just to paint the particularly clear picture of that. I mean, suppose I was being presented with transparent revelation of God's existence in the form of the beatific vision, right? So that I'm just seeing God. I might still be like, but shit, why is there so much evil in the world, right? I mean, and there would still be that problem. How are these intellectually connected in such a way that they could coexist? You could have that problem even if you did think that theism was transparently true. So I think there are a range of those, but the ones that I take up in the book and that seem to sort of animate the online discussions the most are the ones where the evil is taken to be strong evidence that there is no such being as God.
So another question is, what you kind of take the nature and purpose of arguments to be in philosophy of religion in particular, and what you take to be standards of success. And in this case, this is obviously an argument against a position that you adopt. So
Yeah.
maybe think like what should the argument be trying to do if it's to be persuasive?
Yeah. It's such a good question, Nathan. I think it's a super hard one. And really, just asking it strikes me as a really important point in the dialectic here, because I think this meta question about what we're after and what reasoning is supposed to do is often lost in when you get into the nitty gritty and people start arguing about these things. The idea that there is a shared set of aims and goals and what would count as success among it's often very hard to find. And here's part of the problem is that it seems to me that they can vary from context to context. And in what I try to do in the book, and then you can push back on this, is really a kind of a light aim. So the aim I take up in the book is just trying to show this, that whatever the force of the various arguments from evil against theism are, there are ways for the theist to continue to be rational in her commitment to theism, despite those arguments existing. And so there, notice that the aim is something very, very light. It's very parried. It's like, you're not saying, notice that I don't say this in the book, nor do I think it, that the atheist who's deeply compelled by some of the best versions of the problem of evil, I'm not committed to the view that that person's being irrational, right? So I think that the atheist who has paid attention to the very best versions of the argument from evil, and who's weighed the counter evidences fairly and has come to the conclusion that there probably is no God, I don't think that person's making a transparent mistake. I don't think they're being irrational, or they needn't to be. Are there some who are being irrational? Yes. But just like there are some theists, right, who, look, I think on my view, there are some pretty good arguments for the existence of God. Again, we could talk about that. That doesn't mean that every theist is rational, even ones who know about those arguments, because the reasons that they might be believing don't have anything to do with those arguments. And the reasons that they're actually believing are grounded in irrationalities that the arguments just aren't paying any attention to. That happens on both sides. So what are we trying to do when we make the arguments? Well, look, one thing I would say is my overarching view about, this is going to be a view about philosophy more generally, but also about philosophy of religion, is I'm trying to get a holistic picture of the best way to see the world as organized. What's its structure? What's the best way? And there it's a total evidence matter, right? So it's a matter of, I've got to factor in all of the things that I think count for the existence of God, all the things I think count against the existence of God. And then taking those as a package, I come to a holistic conclusion about that. And I think that's the broad way that we ought to be going. And that sounds very obvious when I say it, but one of the things that's very quick to you'll be very quick to notice if you're paying attention, is that lots and lots of the online apologetic discourse, even among professional philosophers at a certain level, operates as if, like, just this argument coming in, like just the logical problem of evil or the evidential problem of evil, and then that's decisive. And everybody who continues to be a theist in the face of this argument is an idiot. Or, the Kalam argument, like there's this one argument, and if you continue to be a non-theist in the face of that, you're an idiot. It's so much more complex than that. And there's a bunch of integrated things having to do with what it means to, what makes a good human life, and how that's organized around the truth, and whether or not the truth itself is all of that is on the table, on my view. And so what I'm looking for really is a kind of broad holism. And the results of this, I think, are a close call in a lot of cases. Maybe one way to think about this, Nathan, if I'm not dragging this out too long already, is, Peter Van Inwagen has this place where he tells us that the reason he thinks that the argument from evil fails, maybe you're sympathetic to this, Nathan, the reason he thinks that the argument from evil against theism fails, he's a well-known theist, is because he thinks every substantive philosophical argument for any substantive position fails. And therefore, since the argument from evil is one of those, it fails. There's a lot to be learned from that kind of skepticism about the effect of arguments. And the reason he thinks that is because he imagines, the way he puts it is, he imagines this neutral band of judges, right? They're not committed on the question of theism, but they do want to know the truth in the domain, and they're prepared to listen to the best arguments of the theist and the best arguments of the non-theist, and to hear them battle it out. And then he thinks a successful philosophical argument will be one that, at the end of that battle, this neutral but fair-minded but interested in the truth interlocutor will lean one way or the other on that. And he thinks that at the end of the day, with every philosophical question, including this one, a neutral, fair-minded set of interlocutors, hearing the proponents and the opponents go back and forth on this for some, significant period of time, fair-mindedly, shouldn't move in either direction. That feels a little heavy-handed to me. I want to have a little more hope in the project of philosophy and our ability to make reasonable judgments about some of the substantive things in philosophy and about theism in particular, than PVI, as we charmingly call him sometimes, Peter Van Inwagen. Then he concludes. But I don't think it's quite crazy the way he puts it. And I guess, Nathan, is this okay to say? I picked up your own. Is this fair? You sound to me like you maybe came into right. You might have come into studying philosophy with a little more hope that philosophy was going to reveal to you the way things really are and do its job of. And it's not always doing that. That's worth seeing. And then my own judgment is I got to ratchet down a little bit what I think philosophy, that is deep inquiry into the substantive nature of reality, what it can get us. And this is to say, my picture is there's a wide angle scope on all of reality that you're trying to paint a picture of, and then you're weighing those pictures against each other. At this point, the picture that includes theism with all the other stuff strikes me is the better picture of reality than any of the ones that lack that, but it's a close call, I think.
Yeah. No, I think what you described there is close to my position. For me personally, and I don't want to I want to make it more about your views than mine, but I mean, I do think that these arguments sort of serve an interesting role in helping people kind of test for consistency or to reach a point of reflective equilibrium. But something that I do find disheartening, I suppose is the best word, it is the fact that there is just this deep disagreement amongst epistemic peers, which there has been for a very long time, and they seem as committed to the truth, as intelligent as one another, and it doesn't seem like these arguments do much to compel one another to the arguments on either side to compel each other to rational belief revision on these questions. And even if they do, the kind of belief revision doesn't guarantee that the person's going to change their mind about the conclusion. Maybe they'll just introduce some auxiliary hypothesis, or they'll modify. And
that's right. So I can't tell how disheartening we should feel about.
Well, maybe it's not disheartening. Yeah, maybe that's just the way it should be, and that's. But it just seems. It seems a weird model if we're like all converging on like this one truth. That it would do that. It seems that we just become isolated in coherent communities, but coherent communities that disagree, kind of thing.
Good. Yeah, I think that's a real worry, and maybe one of the things that. So if you haven't know if you picked this up, Nathan, but I'm fairly new to the Twitter digital world. So I joined Twitter like in 2014 just because some friends were, but I didn't pay any attention to it until I don't know, a year and a half ago or something like that. My son had a thing go viral, and so I started paying attention. I was like, oh, I should start. Maybe I should tweet. Don't know if that was a mistake, but one of the good consequences, this has to be weighed against the bad, but one of the good consequences was learning about people like you and the real atheology folks and a number of other thoughtful atheists. And one of the things I've seen in them, and that I want to take away from the point you're making here, is that when I think about the disagreement literature, so there's this big, Nathan, you just mentioned this, you hinted at it. There's this really deep epistemic question among philosophers of what we should do when we recognize that we disagree with someone who's our epistemic peer. They're as smart as us, or smarter in most of the cases for me. They know at least as much about the subject matter as I know about it. And yet when they weigh the same arguments that I weigh, they come up on the other side of it. Now, given that I'm supposedly an expert in this domain, I don't think what I should do is just give up my view in favor of theirs. But I do think I ought to modulate my commitments down when I learn that people who are just as smart as me and just as knowledgeable as me think P where I think not P. Well, my commitment to not P ought to go down a little, I think, in light of that knowledge, unless I see what it is that's what they've done wrong. And in most of these cases, when we think about the people the atheist philosophers who I have the highest regard for, the Bill Rose and the Paul Drapers, et cetera, of the world. I think I think I see some places where William Rowe sees things differently than me. And I think I see some places where Paul Draper sees things differently than me. But I also know this, that if we really got down and dirty on that and we started parsing it, Paul would have very intelligent things to say about why he judges it that way and while I judge it this way. And so I think I ought to modulate my commitments down. Maybe this is the rub is, do we count that? I see your point. You want to triangulate on the truth. You want it to turn out to be that, like we often think in the natural sciences that it's happening, parenthesis. Maybe it's not happening quite so much as we thought in the natural sciences, right? There's something a lot more like the reflective equilibrium happening there, though it gets hidden from us because of, long story. But nevertheless, I want to say I'm better off intellectually than I was before because I encountered Paul Draper or because I encountered the real theology folks, and I saw, a thing that I was taking as kind of obvious to me, it doesn't look obvious to them. I got to reconsider that, and I feel like I'm better off. So, does it count as triangulating on the truth? Maybe not in exactly the same way that we ideally wanted when we started into this project. But in the sense that I feel like I'm better positioned towards the truth than I was before, and maybe the best I can hope for good philosophical arguments in context with other philosophers who are taking having the same aims is we all get better positioned towards the truth.
So I think there's more that could be said about that, and
sure.
but I'm going to move it more in the direction of the problem of evil now.
Sure.
Than after that,
we could spend the whole time on that.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So at the start, you talk about the problem, sort of disambiguating between kind of the philosophical problem of evil and evil as it's kind of encountered, and how you'd want to disambiguate between those two. Now, I think there's almost an insensitive way of, I'm not accusing you of doing this, but I think something I've seen some apologists do, which has kind of rubbed me up the wrong way, is they've almost said to people, well, you just have a pastoral problem, but it's not a real problem, and some of these atheists are saying, no, like I'm like that, how this emotionally affects me, that's like a part of how bad it is, and that is how much I kind of don't expect, or that isn't consistent with my conception of like this particular kind of theistic being existing. And I wondered, what's your approach to kind of parsing out how you actually deal as a theist in a theistic context with someone who's struggling with, an example of evil versus like the philosophy and the philosophical discourse?
Yeah, good. I see your point. I mean, there's a way of using this distinction between the pastoral problem and philosophical problems. There's a way of using it perniciously, I see now. I meant it. I was hoping that it was making a distinction that's to keep apologists from being dicks. Okay, so what I had been envisioning was something like this, and this has happened to me multiple times, right? I tell this story in the book. I was teaching a class on the problem of evil. This super smart student was totally tracking, was totally into it. Students are all into it. She comes to my office after class, right? So now we've done all our philosophizing, and she comes to my office after class, and she sits down and she tells me about this. Really, her dad is dealing with this totally grotesque, degenerative ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and he's closing in on himself, and she's trying to. It's horrible, right? It seemed totally wrong to me, wrong-headed, to say, well, think back now about those arguments we were just making in class about these things. She wasn't asking about that. She was she was asking, how do I get through this, right? How do I live with the fact that there are these kinds of horrors in my life, right? Not in some abstract storybook way, but no, in my life, I'm dealing. And there, again, she was very smart, and so that conversation can come back around to philosophical issues. but I just want, what I wanted to urge people is not to think that every time they hear someone wrestling with evil, they're asking you, is the set of theistic propositions logically consistent, or is there a evidential relation among those that we ought? They're not. Sometimes they are, right? And this is to your point, is that if the apologist uses this point to then dismiss you when you come to me as a philosopher and you say, but Dan, have you ever seen a child die of Ebola in West Africa? How can that kind of thing? And then if I use that opportunity to be like, well, Nathan, you're just asking the pastoral problem. Let's get. I think that
you just have an emotional problem.
Yeah, you just have an emotional problem, right? That seems to me like that would be a total misuse of the distinction, right? Because I wanted the distinction to function to help us see that not every person who's dealing with evil is dealing with the philosophical problem of evil. Sometimes they're just dealing with the fact that they have to live through it, right? And they have to find a way to live through it. And in cases like that, when you really unpack that in a person's life, it's very rare that philosophy is going to help them. They need you to bring them a meal. They need you to sit with them. They need you to hug them, right? They don't. And apologists who make that, I was trying to block apologists from making that mistake, not trying to give them weaponry for another way to make things difficult.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, I'm thinking, I have particularly maybe Craig in mind when I think of, you know, this kind of objection. I didn't really take any issue with your, you know, the way you talked about it in your book.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, and let's just keep in mind, I mean, the way a conversation is one of the things that's, for what it's worth, I don't identify myself as an apologist, right? I identify myself as a philosopher who's a Christian philosopher indeed. And so some apologetics comes up in my work, but I don't think of myself as principally trying to be an apologist. I'm trying to figure out the right ways to think about these things from a philosophical and indeed Christian point of view. But I do want to note that you know, these contexts can shift pretty quickly. In there, I worry. Look, I don't want to hold it against somebody if they've misread the context when it shifted fast, right?
Right.
And I think it takes a lot of subtlety and attention to the human condition to see when they shift sometimes, right? And I think this is true in apologetic discourse. Like, I mean, let's line up the arguments, get them on a board, and like consider premises and conclusions. But it can, and this happens in teaching, right? We can be doing that, and then like this just happened to me this term. Just I was sort of cavalierly talking about a certain issue in freedom of the will, having to do with wantonness. Harry Frankfurt's got this view about higher order and lower order desires. And I was using this addiction case to motivate it. Right. And, you know, just kind of cavalierly talking about how bad being a heroin addict is and blah, blah, blah. And then a student's like, oh, my sister's a heroin addict. And here's this horrible, like, hold on now, right? I was being cavalier to make a philosophical point. Screw that now. Someone's telling me about the fact that their sister is a heroin addict and she's got a real issue here. Now I got to find a way. I'm teaching a philosophy class to handle that shift in context. But the big point here is just it happens fast, and it takes a certain kind of skill that not everybody has to attend to it. And I don't want to criticize every apologist or every philosopher, every atheist philosopher when they haven't attended to that, when it shifts so quickly.
So the last of these kind of broader points, I suppose, before we get specifically into any of the arguments, is encounters with evil and whether they actually do favor atheistic or theistic considerations. So this is something you point out in the book, and something an atheist I was talking to yesterday pointed out is, you know, sort of ironically, it seemed to them that most of the people they know who have like converted to a religion, it's kind of been the upshot of suffering in their life, you know, and then they've had some kind of, you know, they've sought out maybe like a transcendent narrative to reality. And obviously it's not the case with everyone, you know, like some atheists will get very frustrated about the kind of, you know, there's no atheists and foxholes type claims, but I mean, it does certainly happen at least some of the time. And so I wondered if you wanted to just share some of your thoughts about that.
I mean, just the only reason I bring up the point in the book is just to I don't think I have a worked out view about how it's supposed to go, right? And indeed, maybe the insight is just that there isn't a way it's supposed to go. You encounter evil, and I feel like I've got both experiences inside of me, right? There have been cases where I've encountered some profound evil, and the thing that has struck me is that's not consistent with there being a good God. There's no God, right? Other times it struck me with the only way to make sense of a world that contains that and that also can involve human flourishing is that there's a God, right? And the reason I brought it up was just to note that the poles do come in both directions for us psychically. I don't know which of those is which one has the philosophical upper hand. That was part of the point. Like, let's not let that experience settle the question of which view's got the philosophical upper hand. For that, I think we have to get down and dirty with the actual arguments and evaluate them in light of these inputs. But at least sometimes I have gotten the impression. I like the point that your atheist commentator is making. I don't know if I could go to the majority or anything like that, but I do think that it's ambiguous to me just which direction a person has been pulled in when they've encountered serious evil for themselves. Sometimes it pulls them to the transcendent, and sometimes it pulls them towards unbelief. And I don't think it's obvious that there's a decisively rational response to that.
So to get into the first of the arguments, if we're going to have time to go through, because I'm hoping to go through Mackie's and Roy's, but we'll see.
Okay. Yeah.
So the first is,
that's your way of telling me to be more be more concise. I get it. Okay.
It's okay though. No, we can I can call it at an appropriate point, and we can do something again. It's no problem. Okay. As long as you're open to that, don't feel coerced.
Sure.
So in terms of, we're talking about a logical problem here, and obviously, as you note in your book, there have been several sort of formulations throughout history of this. Yeah. But I mean, a claim that you make, I suppose, is that this is the first time that it's really formulated as an argument against God, against the existence of God in that kind of context, that it's supposed to rationally compel theists to abandon their belief. Yeah. Do you want to kind of maybe just talk about that and what the actual argument is, what that Mackie's doing?
I mean, I've actually wondered about that claim, the full-on claim that Mackie represents, that the logical version that emerges in the middle of the 20th century, especially in Mackie, represents a kind of genuinely distinctive new outlook. I keep trotting that view out and hoping that somebody who understands the history better is gonna say, really, because there are lots of versions of the argument in the history of philosophy for sure. But so frequently it has seemed to me that it takes the form of an explanatory problem, right? Given these commitments, how is it possible for God to be all of these things while also there being evil in the world? But not quite with the polemic force that Mackie gave us, where the claim is, Mackie's claim, it's really striking, right? Is that if you take the set of things that the theist is committed to, that God exists, that God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, those should logically entail that there are no evils at all in the world. And so Mackie's striking claim was that the theist is involved in a kind of logical contradiction. That's why we tend to call it the logical or sometimes the deductive problem of evil. It's because supposedly the theist, if Mackie's right, the theist is endorsing a set of propositions that cannot possibly be true all at the same time because they involved contradictions someplace in that set. That was a super striking claim, really powerful, right? And Mackie was motivated in part, he tells us in the beginning of his article, by the thought that he'd gotten kind of tired of the way that watching theists be like, well, okay, you've got this argument for God's existence. You can reject it. Here's an argument for God's existence. You can reject that. Here's an argument for another argument. You can reject that. And then he notes, but the theist could still be like, but, there's some other way in which I have knowledge of God that bypasses those arguments, and so I still get to be a theist. Mackie's claim was, no, I'm going to produce an argument that shows that if you're going to stay a theist, given what my argument says, you're going to have to just accept irrationality. And that was a striking claim, and so for obvious reasons, it provoked a lot of debate.
So in terms of, I think that I mean, I think this broadly agrees with what you've got to say, but I've seen a useful kind of breakdown of the structure of logical arguments that Oppie gives, where he says there's like a characterization of theism. So that's, you know, like the claims like God having these omni properties or whatever.
Yeah.
There's kind of like a pool of these that you could choose from to create a logical problem. There's then a datum, so that's going to be the existence of evil or suffering, pain, imperfection. You know, again, another pool of kind of claims that you could take as the datum. And then there's going to be the link claim. The link claim is the one that's saying, you know, if this characterization is true, then, you know, this datum isn't true. And the point is that you can't have all of those and that God existing being the case.
You can't accept the characterization, the datum, and the link without involving yourself in an irrationality. Fundamental irrationality.
And so in Mackie's case, then how does Mackie kind of put that together? So what is, I suppose importantly, what is the datum and the links? You've kind of talked a little bit about what his characterization of God is.
Yeah, so if he thinks it goes something like this. This is put, you know, quickly, but nevertheless, I think it gets at the force of it. He thinks something like this. Well, look, so if you accept the omni properties, right? So you accept that God is omnipotent, then that means, he tells us, right? That means that, you know, God's got all the power. There are no limits. The way he puts it initially is there are no limits on what an omnipotent being can do. And if you think God is omnibenevolent, then you think that being will do whatever it can so that there are no bad things, right? And yet there are bad things. So put tersely, it goes like this. You can just hear it in what's sometimes been called Epicurus's old questions. But look, if God is omnipotent, then he would have the power to make sure the world contained no evils. And if he were omnibenevolent, then he would have the will, the desire that there be no evils. So any evils that there are look to be in a logical contradiction with either God's being omnipotent or omniscient. But of course, the theist thinks that God's being omnipotent or omnibenevolent. But of course, the theist thinks that God's being omnipotent and omnibenevolent are essential features of God. So that God must not exist, just from the fact that there are any evils at all, no specific ones, just like, you know, anything would count. The common cold would count, you know, as far, he doesn't give us any specific thing other than we're supposed to be imagining just any kind of bad things. So the claim that Mackie seems to be making is that any versions of suboptimality, small pains, colds, disease, etc., any of those constitute decisive evidence that there's no being that's omnipotent and omnibenevolent, logically.
And is that, you know, sort of in that linking claim, there's a claim of the form. So it's something like, you know, like a good being extinguishes evil
as far as it can.
As far as it can, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, as it can, being omnipotent is going to be.
That's supposed to be the idea. Yeah. So the two what Mackie calls quasi-logical rules or linking principles are: a good being eliminates evil as far as it can, right? But an omnipotent being means that there are going to be no limits to what that being could do, right? Then the omnipotence one is there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. Now, Mackie softens those a little bit later. That's how he announces it at the beginning of his article. A little way through, he concedes that lots of people have thought that, well, there are at least logical constraints on omnipotence. And so Mackie comes around to saying, okay, well, we'll let the theist have that. We'll let the theist have the idea that what it means for a being to be omnipotent is that there are no logical limits. So Mackie eventually concedes, okay, well, we'll let it be the case that God can't work logical contradictions. But he treats it like it's a kind of concession to the theist.
So I guess I'll go on to talk about theistic objections to Mackie's response, but maybe before we do, to kind of offer people some ideas of how to classify some of these objections. I mean, defenses and theodicies. Could you just briefly describe what the goal of a defense and a theodicy is, and then we can talk about some of those in response to Mackie.
Yeah, good. I don't know if this helps. I tend to think of the difference between a defense and a theodicy by thinking of a court case in the U.S. If Nathan was being accused of a crime in a U.S. court, I'm trying to think of something that Nathan would be likely to do. Rob a liquor store, probably something like that, at gunpoint. So Nathan's accused of this in a U.S. court. I mean, the main thing that he has to do in a U.S. court is his defense, at least, just has to show that the prosecution hasn't made its case. So the prosecution has to prove that Nathan, showed up with a gun and demanded the money, etc. Strictly speaking, Nathan's defense team can just be like, look, we're just going to try to make the point that the prosecution didn't succeed in making their case. And then the jury might find him innocent under the law, right? That's parallel to what philosophers think of as a defense in response to the problem of evil. So think of think of Mackie as, or any atheist who's making an argument against God's existence. Think of them as the prosecution. They're prosecuting. They're saying, look, God doesn't exist for these reasons. A defense is just an effort to show that argument, whatever those are, that hasn't succeeded, right? And now notice that's different. Suppose Nathan's team just, throws up a bunch of reasons to think that that the testimony of the people in his case is not reliable, and then they point out, okay, you haven't made your case. You can imagine at the end of that, Nathan, you can imagine you being like, well, hold on, man. Okay. So you've shown I'm innocent under the law, but I actually wanted to do something more. Like I wanted to prove to people I wasn't there. I don't own a gun, right? That's not the kind of thing I would do. That's more in the spirit of a theodicy. So if you think of the argument, some argument from evil trying to show that God doesn't exist, you can think of a theodicy as an effort to show not just, hey, that argument doesn't work, but in fact, there are good reasons that God has for allowing the world's evils. So think about that difference. On the one hand, the defense doesn't try to show you what God's good reasons are, doesn't need to show you what God's good reasons are for allowing these instances of evil. Just, hey, your argument didn't go through. But the theodicist wants to do something more. The theodicist wants to say, there's a positive reason for thinking that God has good reasons for allowing every instance of evil, or allowing or causing, depending on how you want to think about those things. And so the theodicy strategy is much more demanding, right? It demands that you at least think you've got good reasons to offer on God's behalf that are morally sufficient for God to permit the world's evils. That's a very substantial project, right? A lot of theists take up the project. We can decide if it's a fool's errand or not. But notice there's a much weaker project. The weaker project is just, hey, for any argument you present that's supposed to show there's no God, the theist can try to show, hey, that argument doesn't work, which isn't the same thing as showing what God's good reasons are or might be, right? So from that point of view, just for what it's worth, in my book, I really just take a defensive posture. I'm just trying to show that for the logical problem, for the evidential problem, for the problem of divine hiddenness, just, hey, the theist is within her rights to resist some part of this argument, which doesn't mean I've got a story about what God's good reasons are for allowing every instance of suffering, let alone, why people die of Ebola in West Africa, for example.
Would you say that the project of theodicy sort of is something that's more internal to theists in like a religious context, maybe? So, that project is more to take place, in your religious community where you're working out your theology and how that hangs together, where, and maybe that's its role is better served there. I mean, it could then, if it's adequate, it could respond to an argument, but would you say it's like, more analytic theology type thing or something? Would you make that distinction?
Well, I mean, one reason to think it's got its chance there is, there are a lot of shoot, Nathan, say these things, get myself in trouble.
Okay.
There are a lot of
research programs today. No, I'm kidding.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I don't want to be critical of the research program,
Yeah.
but I do think that there's still a role for theodicy, even for the theist atheist discussion. Here's a way of putting that. So I don't think we have anything like a full and complete theodicy. I don't think the best theistic stories tell a totally satisfying story of theodicy. I do think, though, and this is where some atheists will disagree with me for sure. I do think, though, we've made progress. That some of the things that we point to as reasons that God might very well have for allowing evil, some of them are not implausible. And so when I think about the standard theodicy stories, whether it's the free will theodicy or soul making or what have you, my view about those is those get some of the things explained. Those do have plausibility for a range of the world's evils. The reason I think we don't have a totally satisfying one is because we're going to point to a bunch of really, really shitty things that don't get covered by those, right? And they really don't, on my view. It's not like we're close on those. But still, see, I don't know if this will land for your viewers at all. I still think there's a role for those because sometimes atheists make it seem as if the theodicy stories have nothing going for them, and that seems to me to go too far. I think they've got something going for them. Free will can explain some of the world's evils, and soul making can explain why God might morally permissibly allow some of the world's evils, even if it's not going to get to all of them. And the reason it seems to me that that's important is because it does change the dialectic a bit, right? We've now, when I invoke my skeptical worries, the skeptical theism, I'm not saying anything goes. Like the fact that we've had some success does change the dialectic a bit. And so I still think that's relevant, even in my discussion with the person who's not a theist. So I think the theodicy stuff makes some sense. The reason I want to say, with your point about making it internal to religious communities or practices, also it has force, is because this is the part I was hesitating to say before, because people are going to jump down my throat. I've already learned, Nathan, in my short time on the interwebs, that I should learn this easier. No matter what I say, someone's going to think I'm a dick, right? I mean, there's no escaping that. Someone thinks, right, someone's calling me a heretic and somebody else is calling me a soft-minded theist. Like there's no ignoring that. So I can't try too hard here, but here's the way I would put the point. There are things that strike me as having explanatory power for the world's evils, partly because it's already internal to theism. That if I was trying to talk you, as presently a non-theist, into taking this particular value seriously, I would understand you being like, I don't feel it. Yeah, I mean, you have to see it from in here to see. And just as a case in point, right? So Richard Swinburne tells us in his work on theodicy that there's this important notion of being of use, right? And people have heard the Swinburnian theodicy and the value he places on the idea of being of use. And he does say some things about this that I understand why people get pissed off. That is, he says things like, here's the way it strikes me as the most plausible. Suppose my child, God forbid, is killed in a drunk driving accident. Somebody else has gotten drunk and has killed the child, killed my son. Right? It's a horror, absolute horror, unmitigated horror. Now there are two routes from there. One route is my life goes dramatically downhill from there, and I drink myself into oblivion, and very bad. Here's another case. The second case is I'm motivated by this to become an activist for resisting drunk driving, and I develop a organization, dads against drunk driving, and we stop a lot of drunk driving. I take it that all Swinburne's point is, my son's death could be of use, and that's better than it being not of use, and that's a value that ought to be included on our. But now some people hear that as, so you're saying it's okay, your son's death is justified by the fact that that's gross. Yes, that would be gross, but that's not the thing that's being said. The thing that's being said is being of use adds value in a way that, and my own temptation is to think that there are a bunch of those kinds of values that make more sense when you're already seeing them within the theistic frame, and so bringing them out in a non-theistic frame just isn't that helpful. So that was you're just being too interesting, Nathan. I'm blaming you for making me.
No, I think it's. I agree with you. Like I think there are almost these different sort of like gestalts, right? That people just look at reality through. And I talk to. I've got a really friendly Christian I talk to a lot, and she's not particularly into philosophy, but she has views which I consider sort of intellectually untenable. So like she's like a young earth creationist and stuff, but she's a really nice person and great to talk to, very intellectually honest. And she says things to me like when she just looks outside at the trees, she just sees God's design in it and stuff. And I'm like, like I don't. And the way I account for that is that we're just looking at reality and interpreting everything, through these fundamentally different frameworks. And it won't be useful for me to just kind of say, well, you're an idiot who doesn't know about all of these theories I have about biology that order my perception as I look at the tree. But
good. So, now, of course, there's that, and that can't be the end of the discussion, right? I mean, obviously, I'm with you in thinking, qua philosophers, I better be able to work out that gestalt in some respect that shows regard for the biological story about. Right. If I'm insensitive to that and I stick to I, qua philosopher, stick to that gestalt without cashing it out in terms that are defensible to you, the project will have failed. But I think that's exactly right to see that even the way I was putting about my holism from the beginning is a sense of, I don't know, trying to make that a kind of meta principle, right? That, well, we're trying to vindicate the ways the world appears to us, and then some of those vindications succeed better than others, and we're comparing them against each other. I don't know how we did with Theodicies and defenses here, though, just for what it's worth. I mean, I take it that your viewership is very sophisticated philosophically. They're probably already attuned to this distinction already, right?
There's my audience varies so much, all the way from people who are actively teaching and doing PhDs in philosophy, psychology, other subjects, through to people who just want to call each other idiots for disagreeing. So there's all sorts.
Well, we can give people give the people what they want at all the levels. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. So the first thing then, in response to Mackie's logical problem of evil, which we just kind of portrayed, is it's widely regarded that Plantingan sort of almost does away with Mackie's argument, at least with his response. And you break down the Plantingan defense into two stages. So I suppose maybe briefly it might be useful to introduce, I don't know if this will be helpful or if it will just be convoluted, but a sense of sort of modality into the claim that Mackie's making. So he's kind of saying, like necessarily, right, it is the case that the characterization, the link, and the datum can't be true together. And then Plantingan is kind of, I suppose, I look at his project as coming along and saying, well, actually, no, it's like possibly the case, right, that it hangs together differently. And you break that down into two parts. So maybe, if you want to go from there.
Yeah, I don't know. Is this? Do you remember thinking that the stage thing was useful? I mean, I'm thinking about your time here.
Okay, yeah, we can put it all in one thing. I suppose the main way I think about it myself is to show. I think the most useful takeaway is to show that there's a way that the characterization and some claim entail the datum together, And as long as you can show that, like, you've kind of done away with the force of the original argument. Maybe that's a good direction.
Maybe that's a good way of getting it, right? So what Plantinga thinks he can show is, so Mackie tells us that the set of things that the theist believes can't all be true together. It can't be true that God is omnipotent, that God is omniscient, that God, he doesn't say omniscient, but I tend to build omniscience in because I think that maybe it helps to see the story of all the omnis. But if you accept the omnis and you accept that God exists, you are logically contradicting yourself to also accept that evil exists. Those propositions can't all be true together. And then planning a strategy goes like this. Well, I think they can all be true together. Here's how we'll do it. I'll take the propositions you think entail that there's no evil, and I'll add a proposition, that is, that God exists, that God is omnipotent, that God is omnibenevolent, and I'll add a proposition to that set that entails that there's evil, logically entails that there's evil. And if I can do that, I'll have shown you the whole set can be, in fact, be true together. It has to be able to be true together. And then the proposition that he introduces, this is why it's called the free will defense, is it's a complex proposition, something like this, right? God wanted creatures to have robust, that is, libertarian free will. This is why the stuff I was saying earlier about my interest in free will come up. God thought it was very important and valuable for creatures to have libertarian, robust free will. And yet, for any world that God would make that would have creatures with free will, they would use it to go badly. And so any world that had free creatures in it would be a world with some evil in it. And so now that's the proposition. So consider that complex proposition just this. God wanted there to be free creatures, but any world with free creatures would have some badness in it because they'd use their freedom to go badly. And then he says, like, that proposition, when you add it to the other ones, entails that there's evil, but that one's possibly true, right? It's possible that God wanted this, and that free creatures could, it was inevitable that free creatures would use their freedom to go badly. And so I've shown you that these propositions can all be true together. Just possibly, right? It's just barely logically possible. Because remember, don't turn this back on Plantinga. This is on Mackie. Mackie's claim is it's logically impossible for these propositions to all be true together. Then Plantinga shows, no, it's not. It's logically possible for them to all be true together. Then Mackie's argument fails. Like, now you can shift to another argument, or maybe there's another logical argument. Fair enough. But insofar as what Mackie was claiming, that there's no way for these propositions to be true together, I think we can see fairly clearly once Plantinga gets this whole story out that, no, that's not right. They could all be true together. Is it likely they're true? Maybe not. Maybe it's not likely. That's not the point. It's logically possible. It's just about that modal claim, as you noted, Nathan. So, like, I want to make sure that the emphasis gets put there, because a lot of people, I think, misunderstand Plantinga's argument in such a way to think, because he says some other things that will look batshit crazy to non-theists, that I want to just make sure you see he's just talking about logical possibility here, broad logical possibility. And once you give him that, I think he's right to resist Mackie's argument. And as you noted, most people, I mean, it's becoming increasingly popular afresh to think that there might be successful logical arguments from evil. But for a good long time, even atheist philosophers conceded essentially that Plantinga was right, that at least in response to Mackie's argument, there was a way to show it could be resisted.
Yeah, I tend to think that the discourse around this defense is kind of strange because people ignore that it is just that possibility claim. Like, people tend to focus on defending that, that the defense is the actual state of affairs in the actual world, rather than that it just could possibly be, and then the argument doesn't go through. That's all you need.
That's exactly right. But that would be that's not the world we live in. Irrelevant, right? I mean, and one thing to see about that, and that's the part that's hard to, I think, if you don't kind of live in the arguments, you lose, it makes a really big difference whether the thing is just a bare logical possibility because of Mackie's claim. Mackie's claiming it's not even possible. Okay, then the thing I have to show is very small, right? I just have to show it is possible, and it turns out that doesn't take that much effort. I mean, it's kind of hidden by the fact that Plantingan has this large scale machinery that we may or may not want to talk about to get to the big conclusion. I think that actually hides some respects how simple it is to just be like, but all I need is a bare logical possibility, and then that argument goes away. It's not at all easy, on my view, just so that your viewers don't think I'm being cavalier here. I hope I've shown I'm not being cavalier about the problem of evil, but especially just to note this part. Look, though I think that the logical problem doesn't have much to stand on, I haven't yet seen a version that didn't somehow fall prey roughly to the idea that, look, all we need is bare logical possibility, and we're going to be able to cook that up one way or another, even if it's not Plantingan's way. Don't misunderstand. So do I think that there's no serious problem with evil? No, because as soon as we get Roe on the scene, and as soon as we get Draper on the scene, we have versions of the problem that are not at all dismissible in the ways that I'm suggesting we can dismiss. At least I think, I'm tempted still to think we can dismiss logical problems. These evidential versions are just hard as hell, and they get right to the nub of the problem. And maybe we could even give credit to Mackie for, look, even though I think this argument failed, you started that dialectic led us to see how powerful evidential inductive versions of the problem could be that we might have lost if we hadn't seen, oh, it's actually kind of easy to dodge the logical problem. It's not at all easy to dodge these evidential ones.
Did you want to talk, because some people, so again, another way I see the kind of discourse move is, so people bring up kind of free will as a defense, and then they'll say, well, that only accounts for, human moral evil. How do you account for natural evils? And I think this is what you're referring to when you say Plantingan says some things that are going to seem kind of batshit, but you've got to realize it's just the possibility claim.
Yeah, I guess it's worth seeing that, just because it does, if any of your viewers go and read Plantingan and they're not attuned to it, they'll be like, what? Yeah, I mean, so one thing that happens, Nathan, you just nicely noted it, right? That even if you get the free will stuff going, the libertarian free will stuff going, it looks like it does okay for moral evils, right? It does okay for evils. Like, well, why do people steal from each other and murder and what have you? Okay, free will. But lots of the world's evils are not like that. Lots of the world's evils are natural evils. I keep going back to Ebola in West Africa because it's so gross. But pick any number of them about natural disasters, etc. And it doesn't look like free will has anything to do with that. There are various ways to respond to that problem, but the way Plantingan originally responded to it was like this. And seeing this can help you to see the bare logical possibility point, right? Is that Plantingan notes, hey, well, according to some of the world's theisms, and especially Christianity, there are free creatures besides human beings. There are, satanic, demonic free creatures. And so maybe all of the natural evils are caused by these free satanic demonic creatures. So Ebola in West Africa is being caused by Satan, or earthquakes are being caused by Satan. Now, look, does Plantingan think that Satan is causing Ebola? No, that's not the point. The point is
maybe Augustine does, but
maybe that's true actually. Yeah. It's not so far off in some of the cases in history of philosophy. That's true. But I don't think Plantingan, I certainly don't, right? I think it's extremely implausible. But but don't go away saying, please, dear viewer, don't hear or read Plantingan's defense and say, look, I can dismiss Plantingan. He's a nut job because he thinks Satan is causing Ebola. He doesn't think that. He's pointing out to you that it's a broad logical possibility. You can't rule that logical possibility out. And Mackie's claim was it's impossible for there to be the world's evils and also for these things to be true. And the bare logical possibility that satanic forces could be the cause of natural evil is enough to show, wait, you haven't made your case, my man. You have not shown that these things cannot all be true together. They can be true together. True, you'll have to accept some other really crazy premises, but that moves us into a different problem, right? It's no longer the logical problem now, right? And so we should shift our attention, but don't complain to Plantingan about that. Complain about Mackie, or don't complain at all. Maybe it's the best way.
So another then objection that comes sort of off the back of the free will defense then is going to be something like, well, it seems that God could actualize, people who are free, but who only choose the good, and that seems to especially kind of fall out of Molinism, which I mean is quite a popular theological model. And some people say, well, I actually, that is a part of the theistic hypothesis, because God is such a being, that has free will and only ever chooses the good. So to say you can't kind of just rule it out in a way that some people might be inclined to. And then you talked about these strongly and weakly actualized possible worlds and what that has to do with it. Do you want to just explain what that sort of response is?
Sure. I mean, it's partly kind of fun because it does. I mean, some people put it like this: that when as you know, Molinism is a very popular view among contemporary philosophers of religion. It's not my view. I'm not a Molinist myself. I'm not very attracted to Molinism, but it became really popular. Some people think it's partly because Plantinga's defense, because some people say Plantinga reinvented Molinism right there in that defense. Like, did he know about Molina? I don't know if it's obvious that he actually knew the medieval Molina stuff. I mean, he eventually knew lots of people who knew Molina stuff and thought a lot more about it. But I think when he was first developing his defense, he might have been generating it kind of ex nihilo. In any case, here's the idea. When Mackie first introduced his argument, he actually tries to respond to a possible free will response by trying to get us to imagine the following case. He says, well, look, even if creatures have robust, call it libertarian free will, he thinks that this notion's incoherent, but he doesn't tell us why. But even if creatures did have robust freedom of the will, it seems like God could make a world in which every creature has free will, but they only use their freedom to do what's right. Right? And if that's the world God should have made. Now call that, what I call it in the book, is call that a Mackie world. A Mackie world is a world in which everybody has robust free will, but God has organized it so that the creatures only do what's right. And if that's the world God should have made, and since that world doesn't exist, Mackie thinks there's no God. Plantinga's strategy is to try to show that maybe, just possibly, a Mackie world is impossible. Right? That is impossible for God to achieve. And the way that he does this is by saying, look, suppose this is the way it gets set up, that God does know what everybody will do in any possible circumstance they'd be put in, right? So he in the actual world, he made it so that Nathan would, unwisely decide to have a conversation with me today, right? But he knows every possible world in which there were other things that Nathan would have done with his time, right? And then what Mackie's imagining is, well, if God sees every way the world could have been, then one of the ways the world could have been is that everybody chooses to do what's good and right. And so God could just pick that one world to actualize. And Plantinga's response to that is roughly this. Possibly, there's no such world in which everyone freely chooses to do what's right in this way. Possibly. And why think that's a possibility? Well, look, imagine, now here's the weak, strong actualization distinction. Suppose God wants to make a world. To strongly actualize a world is to cause it to be the case, right? So could God have caused it to be the case that Nathan, instead of talking to me today, was, reading Plato at this time, right? Yes, God could have caused that. He could have strongly actualized the world that had everything in it just the way it was up to this moment, but Nathan was reading Plato instead of talking to me. He could have caused that. But here's Plantinga's claim. If he causes that, then Nathan doesn't freely read Plato. Right?
So it's like a kind of incompatibilist sort of...
That's right. It's absolutely essential to this account about freedom of the will that the notion that Plantingan has in mind is an incompatibilist conception. That is, Plantingan is explicit about the fact that when he says, suppose human beings are robustly free, he means free such that no antecedent features, no features antecedent to their decision guarantee that they'll make that decision. And that's a fairly intuitive notion of freedom of the will. Now, lots of people will resist it, but just notice he only needs it to be possibly true, right? Is it possibly true that freedom of the will is such that if you really have it, no antecedent features of the universe guarantee that you'll do the thing that you do? And so he thinks.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's.
I was going to. When you say he only needs it to be possible in this case, is this because he's saying like it's possibly a necessary truth and an S5 modal collapse thing, or is it something else?
Good. I don't think it is, although maybe we could get it that way. He just needs it to remember. So I didn't specify this very clearly, but when we were talking before about the proposition that when added to the theistic set entails that God exists, or sorry, that there's evil, it's built into that, right? So that proposition is there are free creatures because it was very valuable for there to be free creatures, and freedom means freedom in the incompatibilist sense. And then he just needs that whole proposition to be possibly true in order for the set to be possibly true altogether. So all he needs is for each of those elements, possibly God really cares about free will, possibly the kind of free will that really matters is the kind that's incompatible with determinism or antecedent determination, and possibly any creature who's made with that kind of freedom will go wrong in any world in which they're placed. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
So could God strongly actualize a world in which everybody was doing what's right? Yes, God could strongly actualize. That is, cause it to be the case. That's true. But if he causes it to be the case, then they won't, in fact, be performing their actions freely. So he would have to weakly actualize the world. What's to weakly actualize the world? Well, to weakly actualize the world is to make every feature of the world right up until the moment when Nathan has to decide whether to read Plato or have a conversation with me, and then let the chips fall where they may, right? And now it's a really open question: is Nathan going to have the conversation with me, or is he going to read Plato? We should have made these things with moral valence. I don't think there's any deep moral valence here, but imagine that they were. And then here's Plantingan's claim: possibly any world that God would weakly actualize, containing free creatures, would have it such that they go wrong, they do bad things. And so now it turns out that possibly there are no Mackie worlds. Remember, a Mackie world is a world in which everybody's free, but they use their freedom to do what's right. One thing that's crucial about this, and Plantingan calls this Leibniz's lapse, is he thinks Mackie falls prey to the Leibniz's lapse. Here's Leibniz's lapse. It's thinking that from the fact that some outcome is logically possible, that therefore an omnipotent being can bring it about. It's a very tempting thought, right? If you think that the only limitations on God are logical limits, there are no other limits on God, just logical limits, and you know that a certain state of affairs is logically possible, it's broadly logically possible, it's very tempting to think that, well, then that being, that omnipotent being, could bring that about. Here was the insight that you might think of as the fundamental Plantingan insight here, was the thought that there are some genuinely logically possible worlds that depend on the cooperation of free agents to bring it about, independently of what God wants. So God could want it, and it could be a logically possible one, but its actualization requires cooperation among free creatures, that if God imposed on that cooperation, they wouldn't be free. So from the fact that it's logically possible that there be a world with free creatures who always choose right, it doesn't follow that that's what Tom Flint has come to call a feasible world. It's not a world that God can get, right? He can't guarantee it, because to guarantee it would be to violate the freedom. Big point. All of that just has to be logically possible. And I don't hear anything in it. I don't think anybody who thinks very carefully about it hears anything in it that's logically inconsistent. And so you get the big conclusion possibly there are no Mackie worlds. Mackie thinks, well, it's logically possible, so God could get it.
And again, it's that there's possibly no Mackie worlds. So,
that's right.
So you say possibly there are Mackie worlds as
well.
That's
exactly right. That was a misstep. That's right. It's not that maybe there are no Mackie worlds. It's that, there are Mackie worlds, but possibly God can't actualize it. He can't get it. Right. Even though it's
that's all you need to address the argument. That's right. The point.
That's right.
I see.
That's right. Yeah. Good catch.
Because there was a sort of thread in my mind that still thinks, well, but on the other hand, possibly God could do that, and that's what. But the point is that we're talking about what's sufficient to kind of resist the argument, rather than
that's right.
That's a different direction.
I think that's exactly right, and good. Plantingan himself. Maybe I should speak for myself. I still think it's plausible that from the beginning, before God actualized any world, a world in which everybody went right was a broadly logically possible one. Now, once people start going wrong, it's not, you can't change. My own view is changing the past is not logically possible. And so you end up pretty quickly in the situation in which you've got to work with suboptimality. And on my view, that's a broadly important part of responding to the problem of evil, is that if anything like this story is right, then very early on, God had to start working with suboptimality.
So I'm wondering at this point, because I heard, maybe I packed a bit too much in, but I was thinking of moving on to like Roy's evidential argument at this point. But the thing is, we're about like an hour and 15 minutes in almost,
sure.
And I don't want to eat too much into your time. Maybe if you'd be open to it, we could do Roy's evidential problem at some other point. Sure. I don't know how you'll.
That'd be great. Yeah. And maybe it's even worth noting there, Nathan. I focused that chapter on Roy's argument partly because it's tidy and influential and powerful. There have been updated versions of the evidential problem that I don't say really anything about, just some footnoting, and we could maybe even say a little bit more about those, which should be fine too.
Well, this was one of the things. You don't feel compelled to answer this now, but okay. I was going to ask you these sorts of questions because I've seen in terms of interpretation, people characterize Roy's argument as a logical problem, as like a Bayesian argument, as a likelihoodist argument, and then there's other arguments which more clearly fall under one of these, like Draper's Bayesian argument, and I thought we could talk about some of those sorts of things.
That'd be fun. Yeah. You'd make me rethink all of that too, which would be good. Yeah.
If you've still got a little bit of time, though, I will take some questions from the audience if people have them. So just tag me in the chat if you've got them. There was a question that came in, and I don't speak Arabic, so I can't say what your name is. But question for Dan: how does Plantingan's insistence on the possibility of evil show that Mackie's argument doesn't succeed?
Good. Yeah, that kind of gets at the broad scope, so it's kind of nice, right? So I worry about just repeating things. But sometimes we just need to hear them fresh, right? So So think of it like this. Mackie's claim is, this is the force of the argument. The conclusion of the argument is, it's not possible for all the premises of the theistic set to be true together. So if the claim is it's not possible, then that argument fails if I can show it is possible. That's all it takes to show that the argument fails, is that, in fact, the evil is possible, holding fixed all of the commitments of the theist, holding fixed that God exists, that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. So that's all it takes, because that's what Mackie is claiming is impossible. He's claiming it's impossible for these to be true together. Well, then just the mere possibility of evil, given those things, is enough to demonstrate that the argument has failed.
There were some questions. Oh, and I want to say thank you, Max, by the way, for the super chat.
Nice.
So there were some questions about your own position as well. I think maybe some people aren't familiar with the fact that you're an open theist, at least as far as I understand as well.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Hang on, let me try and.
Because I said the thing about not being a Molinist. Yeah.
So someone said, like going this route seems to entail dropping an omni, and maybe you don't even drop the omnis. Maybe you just mean something different by them as well.
Good.
So maybe do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So I haven't been yet talked out of my onto theology, my perfect being theology. So I'm still committed to the view for now that the best way to think about God is as a being than which a greater cannot be conceived. To think about God as that than which a greater cannot be conceived. And so I myself maintain the omnis. I continue to think that God is best understood as omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. But remember, I already think that there are logical constraints on omnipotence. I think everyone should think that. I don't think that's a concession. I think it's weird not to think that. We could talk more about that if we needed to. But once you see that there are logical constraints on omnipotence, like, for example, it's not a limitation on God's power that God can't make a stick with one end, right? A stick with one end is not a thing. It's a door with one side is not a thing. And you're like, oh, God's a wuss because God can't make a door with one side. No, that's just not a thing. It's logically incoherent, right? Once you concede that, so God can do everything that's logically possible, then I think there's a parallel note with knowledge, right? That I think an omniscient being is a being that knows the truth value of every proposition that has a truth value. But not every utterance that I can say has a truth value. And one of those, so when an electron is going to be emitted from a certain radioactive thing, that at time t, maybe it doesn't have a truth value whether it's going to do it at time t. It's indeterminate whether it's going to do that. And the same thing I think with robust free actions. So what Nathan is going to freely choose to do tomorrow might be a genuinely libertarianly free choice. Most of mine probably, look, I'm 53. A lot of mine are now structured by character, my grandkids are in danger. I'm going to run into the building, right? I'm not, things have been struck, but there might be some cases where I have genuine freedom. And in those cases, my view is not even God knows what Dan will do with his free choice when he confronts that. And then you say, oh, well, then he's not omniscient. And I say, no, he's still omniscient because he knows the truth value of every proposition that has a truth value. But there are some propositions that don't have a truth value yet. And they won't have them until the choice. And that's how I think robustly free choices are, that they don't have the question, tomorrow, will Nathan have eggs Benedict for breakfast? If it's a genuine free choice, there's just no truth value about that until tomorrow morning. Right. And so I say we keep the omnis. God is omniscient, but it doesn't. Omniscience doesn't involve exhaustive foreknowledge. Right? So now, if someone says, if Stacy says, "Well, you did drop the omni," I'll just say, "Well, I mean, if you think that's part of what it is to be omniscient is for there to be exhaustive foreknowledge, then I can see you conceding that. I don't think that drops the omni because I don't think it's a very plausible account of what omniscience is for various other reasons having to do with freedom and other forms of indeterminacy. But I myself want to try to put it in terms of maintaining the omnis.
There was a question that came in terms of reconciling this position with biblical prophecy. And there's further questions which relate back to the first question about the kind of status of arguments and infinite belief revision that's possible. But I can think, perhaps you could even reject that those are examples of prophecy, but I don't know where you go with that.
My temptation is to think that it's complex about those things, and it depends on the case. So remember, I was saying, so a couple points. One is, I do think that there are, as my point about my being 53 was supposed to partly illustrate, I do think there can be pockets of determination, right? People's characters can be fixed in such a way that what I'm going to do in the future gets pretty well fixed because of free choices I already made, right? So, someone offers me wet spinach or cookies, you can be pretty sure I'm going to take the cookies if you know me at all, right? And that's because of a bunch of things about my character that I've fixed over time, right? So one thing you can say about the prophecies is that at least some of them might have to do with the fact that, look, there can be pockets of local determination, pockets of local fatalism that God, knowing everything that God knows, because God knows where every particular particle is aligned, what all the inner lives of all the people, he knows all of that. He's going to be a maximally excellent predictor. And when those actually solidify into guarantees, the way they might with my cookies versus wet spinach, he can say, oh, well, now I know, right, that this is going to happen at this time. So that's one thing to see, is that one way to account for prophecy is that there can be pockets of local determinism and that God would be able to recognize them and make the predictions. Another thing to see is that lots of the New Testament or the Old Testament prophecies look like they must have been conditional, right? I mean, think about Jonah's, the prophecy that was that Jonah was to announce, 40 days and Nineveh will fall, right? That was the prophecy. Turns out Nineveh didn't fall, right? That's because the prophecy, it turns out, though it sounded like it wasn't, was conditional, right? It was what the prophecy was really: 40 days and Nineveh will fall, unless they repent, right? And now there might be lots of them that are like that, right? So there was the prophecies themselves had built-in conditionals associated with them, conditions, also fine. And then the third thing I'd note is, just for what it's worth, my own view is that there's nothing about one way to guarantee prophecies is for God to just bring it about that it occurs. So if God wants, the prophecies of Isaiah to be fulfilled in the person of Jesus, for example, he can just cause that to be true when Jesus is born and comes into the world. He's still omnipotent. So God can fulfill prophecies just by making it so, where the prophecies don't involve his anticipating them because he's seeing the future, but just is committed to bringing it about. So those there are sort of three different ways that you might think about the prophecies aligning. But note, I'm not myself. What I'm saying is, I don't myself think that my open theism creates any special problems for prophecy in those regards. Though I think it's a super interesting question. Yeah.
Peter asked, could I just run a slightly different version of Mackie's argument that takes into account the fact that these broad possibilities don't obtain in the actual world? And I mean, as I read this question, this also got me thinking about that. Because I think there's basically, in terms of Oppie's characterization of these logical arguments, there's a pool of characterizations, pool of datums, and data, and a pool of linking claims, and people can essentially choose from those in combination, as long as they're logically valid. They can choose from those combinations in such a way that they can address almost any theistic hypothesis. But then the theist can always revise their beliefs in such a way that they never really abandon the proposition that God exists, and you kind of get in this vicious dialectical sort of circle. But I mean, I don't know if that's how you would go about answering this question. That was just
partly yes. I mean, there's the one annoying point here, Peter, that I hope you don't hear is too annoying, right? Just note that one thing to say about what your good question is, the fact that these broad possibilities don't obtain at the actual world isn't by itself evidence that they're not possibilities, right? So here's a thing that doesn't obtain at the actual world: me driving in my car right now. Right? But wasn't there a time, maybe 10 minutes ago, when I could have made it a possibility that I was driving in my car? It takes me a little while to get to where my car's parked, so I had to give myself 10 minutes. But there's a possible world in which I'm driving my car right now. It's not that far from the actual world, right? So the fact that a possibility doesn't obtain in the actual world doesn't entail that it's not possible, that it's not a possibility. And now, maybe what you want to say is there a way of reformulating Mackie's argument so it just says,
in the actual, if God exists in the actual world, it won't, there won't be any evil or something.
Yeah, something like that, right? Then I just want to note, I think that's nicely shifting away from a logical problem to an evidential problem about what's true at the actual world. And there, I think, good. Then let's take up the best versions of that we see. But the fact that it's a logical issue, if it's going to be logical, it can't be a matter of just the broad possibilities that obtain in the actual world. The fact that that it's supposed to be a logical problem means that it will have to close off all of the other possibilities. Now, again, maybe there's some way of restraining that. Well, what I'm tempted to say is any way that we restrain that to get the kind of tension that Peter's feeling, which I'm not denying that there's a real thing there to feel, will seem to me like, well, that's just to move to this evidential argument and to be concerned with not logical impossibilities, but the improbabilities that obtain in virtue of what we know about things at the actual world. Yeah, I don't know. How's that sounding? Did you feel like I was? Because your point, Nathan, was.
Well, my point, I mean, I guess that there's one. The response that you gave is a response to the actual question. I was just thinking, where does that leave us if once we've responded?
Yeah,
which is a slightly different question. Yeah.
So. Maybe this is worth saying. One of the things that I can feel behind Peter's question. Thanks, Peter. But what I feel behind your question is, look, there is something deeply unsatisfying about Plantingan's defense. I think we should all feel that. We should all be like, so you carved out this tiny little logical possibility, but we want more. Okay, I think we do want more, but I think we want the more in light of a different argument than this one, because this is all we needed for this argument. And maybe there's another distinction I want to draw that I think will just take us too far afield. So I'll just say, I think there's still a spirit of Peter's question left unaddressed, and I think you're headed in that way, Nathan. Right? Like, what is it about?
What's almost like what it feels like to me is from this is from both perspectives, both the theist perspective and the atheist perspective, that offering these arguments to the side that is quite firmly committed to the opposite of the claim you're trying to establish with the argument. It's sort of like trying to nail Jello to the wall, in the sense that it's kind of how you go about resolving that tension. If you do accept all the premises, is open to, it's like a quine duhem type thing of, there's almost like an infinite number of ways of resolving that. And and you can't guarantee the person's going to go in the direction you want them to and just go, now I adopt the subset of beliefs that you wanted me to. Instead, now I'm an open theist, for the atheist. Or perhaps the theist will say something, you'll be like, now I believe, like the proponent of the claim, now I believe a Platonic form, the universe did begin to exist, but I think a Platonic form caused it. So something weird. I mean, I know they're taken to be acausal, but I'm just giving it
right. I see the point. Good. I guess that's right. Maybe this could be a problem with argumentation in general, okay? But the way I wanted to, at least what I was hoping it would land, is that given that point, the way I'm intended to think of it is bare logical consistency is too easy, right? It's really so easy to get in these quine duhemian ways. Like just modify something around the very edges and you'll end up with logical consistency. And that's not to say that I don't think we learned something from that debate. I think we learned that at the very least. But that if you force me to say, well, where's the real action? It's going to have to be down and dirty with this is to Peter's point, it's going to have to be down and dirty with the way the world actually is. And whether or not the way it actually is, this is the thing I want to say, but the way it actually is, I think it's going to be ludicrously hard to render the way it actually is logically inconsistent with the existence of God. But I think that leaves it very possible to render it evidentially inconsistent with the existence of God, or evidentially in deep tension with the existence of God. And maybe I just have the feeling now that that's got a chance of being more illuminating. And for just the reason you're saying about the nailing of the Jello, is that, I'll just move a little, right, and get logical consistency and be essentially, but that's not what we want. We want to, maybe that's another point about the beginning question we were having, Peter, about what we're up to. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we were just trying to figure out the truth like we really, I don't want to just parry your objections to my view. I want to figure out if I've got the right view, right? And of course, that involves some parrying because I still have to explore the logical space of my own view in ways, right? You raise an objection, I say, oh, well, it turns out my view is a little more flexible than I thought, or it involves more than I thought. And that's good, but still with the motivation to, like, I'm not just trying to get out of this. You're not just trying to get, I can tell, Nathan, you're not just trying to get out of it. You want to know, right? And that's partly what you're finding frustrating about it. And it feels to me like we've got a better chance of centering in on things that we can share, that we care about when we move to the evidential level.
So there's just a couple more questions from the chat. So I'm not going to take in any more from the chat, just so people know who are listening, because it will just be too much to go through them all.
Sure.
But so Justin asked, why should we think that our understandings of logic or time would apply to God? Could our understanding of logic be arithmetic compared to God?
Good. Yeah, I think that's a good question. It lies behind, in some respects, a broader kind of impulse towards what's sometimes called skeptical theism in my own thinking about the evidential problem, which will probably come up if you and I talk some more, Nathan. But just, on the one hand, so I want to accept Justin's point. Time and logic are deeply puzzling, and I don't think I can rule out the possibility that from the divine point of view, the truth of the matter is nothing like it seems to me with respect to time and logic. So that's one point to note. But then by the same token, unless that's going to be just a total conversation stopper for any philosophical discussion about the divine at all, we're going to have to allow that the way things seem to us when we're trying to do this well together is at least verisimilitudinous, right? At least some respect in which what we can agree upon about time and logic bears some relationship to God. Otherwise, the conversation kind of evaporates. And again, there are people, right? I'm not telling Justin not to be one of these people, but there are people who can internalize the point Justin's making and then just tap out of all philosophical questions about God. I can't stop you, right? I don't have a decisive argument against it. But insofar as we are engaged in a cooperative project of trying to understand these things better using the tools that we have, I think as theists, here I'll be speaking for myself, as a theist, my mode is to operate with the idea that the best ways that we're thinking about time and logic bear some verisimilitudinous relationship to the way that they operate for God. Largely because if I don't accept that, there's no point in our conversation. We should just be having lunch, right? Which again, some people are going to accept it. I still have a kind of hopeful view that we're going to be able to work some things out. But point taken.
Are you someone who, because I know, and this is something we got a chance to talk to, you talked about like Morean shifts and like externalist justification.
Yes.
Are you someone who would say like you have a kind of sense of God either through religious experience or through, and if you do, would you say that that's a way then maybe of being able to say that you at least have some way that you can attach to, like reality from God's point of view, maybe, as it were?
That's right. Yeah, that is true. So yeah, broadly, I was hinting at this with this wide scope kind of holism that I was recommending early on, that, you picked up on the Quine Duhem stuff. It's kind of the way I'm thinking about it, just full wide scope, not just natural sciences. And where one of those inputs for me is experiences that seem to me to have been and to be of God or caused by God, that the best explanation for them seems to be that for me. But the thing I'm resisting is I don't take that like, I don't take it neat. It's not like, well, I've had this experience that God exists, so now I'm building everything else around it. I mean, it's more like one input into that total holism is these experiences
that when I put them in the frame look to me to be best explained by there being a God. But if the pressures came in the Duhemian way, in the Quinian way, if the pressures came, that's a thing. It could go right. It's not playing a foundational role. It's playing a sort of central web role. That what's really doing the explaining is the whole thing, with that just being one piece. But I do think you're right that gives me a way of saying, like, given that that's one of the inputs, I think I've got some reason for thinking that my experiences are
at least analogous to God's.
At least analogous. Yeah. I get really tied up in my own thinking, to be honest with you, Nathan, between, analogy and, sometimes I'm tempted to forms of univocity where, like, it's really like the way I think about things is exactly the way God thinks about them. Not all things, but that they bottom out in some things where what God thinks of a thing and what I'm trying to think of a thing we mean them in the same way. That's going to be, for lots of classical theists, they're going to be pissed at me about that. And it's analogy all the way down, and Aquinas was the man, all of that. But I at least sometimes feel this scotistic impulse towards univocity about some of these things.
So the last question then from John V, he said, what's your opinion on apologetics that say evil is actually evidence for God?
Well, I mean, I don't really know the Frank Turek stuff. I've only recently started to see it because of, as I said, Nathan, about my appearance on Twitter, and what I've seen there has not been particularly inspiring. I can say that much. Maybe with all apologetics, I feel something like this, that, like, are you on to just a little something, but it's so half-baked or ham-handed that it doesn't get very far? Like, so I say at the end of my book that I think there really is. Look, I don't think there is a, sometimes people say this, like, that the atheist has a problem of good, right?
I think it's not. I think it's almost a completely different thing that Frank's getting at. I think he's saying more like evil is really a problem for the atheist, but he really means like it's a practical problem because atheism's like nihilistic, and so there's no way to
exactly, because the atheist can't have an account of what makes something evil, or right. And there, I just want to know, like, I think, like, way down deep, like after a bunch of meta-ethics, in which you would see, in which you admit that, of course, the utilitarian has an account of what evil is and doesn't need God, and of course the Kantian, at least a certain kind of Kantian, has an account of what evil is that doesn't need God, and the virtue theorists can have an account. They don't need God to get an account of what evil is. They've got accounts of what evil is. Way down deep, I still have a kind of theistic splinter in the brain that there's something left over in accounts of evil when there's no God in the picture, when the universe is not genuinely, sort of at its core, axiologically good. There's no way for it to be axiologically good at the core. I think something is left out of that story, but it's so far down, and after so much meta-ethics and recognizing so many ways in which the theist is, the non-theist can be a moral realist and can endorse all kinds of true propositions about morality. Only way at the end of that do I say, well, there's this thing I think is left over still, but that's a long way from anything as ham-fisted as evil is actually evidence for God, right? No, I don't, that's not quite right. Is there a nub of something that maybe I would accept when pushed all the way down after a very deep dive into the core of moral theory? Maybe, right? But it would come so late in the game as to be not useful in a quick hitter like this.
So I think I'll leave it there because we've been going for an hour and 40 minutes, and so that was a bit longer than I'd sort of wanted, and we didn't even get around to like half the questions I had. So I clearly,
well, we need
too much. Yeah,
either that or I need to shorten my answers. Like, I don't know.
Well, I think they were good answers, and I did ask some quite broad questions as well. So I think there was a lot to say about a lot of them. So yeah, thank you for coming on.
Of course.
I mean, we can set something up for whenever. I mean, I'm currently doing my master's dissertation now, so my time is quite flexible. So just whenever over the next few months.
Oh, wow. Okay. I thought you were going to say, and so I'm buried under all my research, but no.
Well, it's in terms of schedule though, you know, like I'm not like, well, I have a commitment 9 to 5 to be in this location or something. I mean, I can just get up whenever and go to sleep whenever and come to my computer and read things, which is quite nice.
I remember those days before I was old. Yeah.
Right.
Nice. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure, Nathan, and yeah, I'll look forward to more.
Great. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for watching. If you've enjoyed it, be sure to like the video, leave a comment, letting me know what you think. If there are some questions, I'm sure I can get them over for the next episode that I do with Dan. And if you want to go over to Dan on Twitter and annoy him and let him know how bad Twitter can be with theist discourse, then be sure to do that. Thanks, everyone.